Hello. My name is James Beck. I work at Consensus. I lead communications and content. We're hiring, so if you want to talk to me after, feel free. But today, I'm actually going to talk about something that has kind of nothing to do with Consensus, but a lot to do with political philosophy, economics, natural resources, and a topic I'm really passionate about, which is what you can see here, street trees. So the title of the presentation is How Can Ethereum Extend Personhood to Natural Resources? So, I submitted this talk last week, and hardly a day goes by without a major international news story covering some sort of man-made or natural disaster. And this was last week, but this week we had over 100 people in Germany die because of flooding. There are enormous wildfires right now in California that are kicking up so much smoke and haze that apparently yesterday in New York City, the pollution levels sort of looked like, when I used to live in China at 200 particulate matter. So it's, every day we hear these intense stories of natural resources, destruction of widespread species loss, and really these big problems that seem to call for big solutions. So what do we know? What are these big solutions? Typically, we have elected or in many cases, unelected representatives that go to the UN. They go to COP27, I believe it is. They come up with proposals and they have disagreements, and it leads to stalemate. So which countries are most responsible? Who pays more? Who enforces the emissions reduction goals? The enormity of the problem, and often lacking a singular solution for a global treaty like the Paris Accord, which came out in 2015 here, means that we end up looking outside of these transnational intergovernmental organizations. So it may start with aviation industry or the steel industry setting exact targets. It might actually happen between two countries like the US and China setting a bilateral agreement. Even better, it could happen at a company level. Various companies in the US are setting CO2 emissions targets. And then you even get smaller and smaller, and it starts happening at perhaps an organization level or even a free association level. But when I think about my own moral imperative to either write about this or even better yet, do something about it, it kind of makes me feel powerless. These are huge events happening all over the globe, and they are often decided at events that many of us have to send a representative or have no say. I also don't believe that individuals, necessarily can impact major things. I flew here, that uses a lot of carbon. I minted this essay as an NFT that, by some estimates uses a lot of carbon. But at the same time, when you feel powerless, I do think there are ways in which we can, as individuals, use technologies like Ethereum to create, non-state, non-privatized organizations. So what I'm here to do today in this 20-minute talk, I think it is convince you that there are ways of creating associations that resemble neither a state or a corporation or a private market. And then secondly, that natural resources like street trees or an irrigation canal in New Mexico actually could be persons, as in they could be given the rights that humans have. And it sounds a little bit far off, but bear with me, I'll get to it. And so I'll tell you a little bit about my own story of actually understanding a street tree map in New York City, and they're one of the greatest common pool resources in my opinion, and also how we can use Ethereum not just as like a crowdfunding financial coordination mechanism, but as a way of conferring rights to non-humans and natural resources. So, common pool resources. It's kind of cool that you hear this term thrown around a lot in Ethereum because we talk about even funding open source protocols as, a common pool resource. What is a common pool resource? It's something that no one owns, but everyone benefits from. And so street trees are an amazing example. But if you're using, very clinical, boring language of economics, common pool resources refer to a core resource which provides a limited supply of extractable units. And so this is economics, which means it's all about how humans can extract a resource and use it for their own life, which, you have to eat, you have to cut down a tree to make a house. So there are reasons why common pool resources are the most regulated things on this planet. But the other thing about common pool resources is that this is a chart I made to sort of understand why a street tree is a common pool resource, but something like a tree in a public park, that's actually a public good, and then private trees are private goods, and then something like a private park where people come together and associate and pay dues, that's called a toll good. And yeah, so you see these two things, level of subtractability and difficulty of exclusion. Just very simply, the reason why street trees are common pool resources is because they have both a high level of subtractability and a high difficulty of exclusion. So put more simply, that means you can't exclude anyone from benefiting from a street tree. It provides shade, it leads to less water runoff and erosion, and it also sucks carbon from the air and pollution. However, they're more likely to be extracted. And what I mean by that is it's pretty easy for people to not care about trees, throw trash in the tree bed, have a dog pee on its bark, or even someone's building a new apartment and they can just cut down the tree and replace it with something younger. So that makes them both a good example of common pool resources. Maybe street trees aren't your thing. So other examples are a field for grazing sheep, a river that everyone uses for irrigating crops. There are a lot of examples of common pool resources. I think actually Kevin Owaki was giving a talk and he would argue that open source funding is a common pool resource. And when we talk about common pool resources, we hear this phrase, which I think is actually a bit harmful, but tragedy of the commons. So it first came up 200 years ago. This guy named, he was a British economist, William Forster Lloyd. But about 100 years later, it was more popularized by Garrett Hardin, and he wrote a book about tragedy of the commons that came out in 1968. The idea is that when humans act in their own self-interest, they become uncoordinated, and when humans are uncoordinated, you have the depletion of natural resources, which affects all of us. So I actually think that his thinking was highly influenced by Thomas Hobbes, the idea that there's all humans, and he uses the word man, all men are self-interested and only act in competition with each other. And because of that, you need something called the Leviathan, which in modern text is like a government or a supranational organization, something that can sort of hold together humans and make sure that we're not uncoordinated. But I think these actually end up being both concepts and they reduce the way we think about human coordination. So there's other ones like prisoner's dilemma. There's more positive ones like the logic of collective action. You hear them a lot in political science. But one of my favorite thinkers who has both been almost attributed with the term tragedy of the commons, but actually critiqued it, is Eleanor Ostrom. So she wrote Governing the Commons in 1990. She ended up winning the Nobel Prize in Economics, the first woman to do so, by 2009. And she passed away in 2012. And so one of my professors in undergrad was her student and worked on a lot of manuscripts together. And when I was finishing my thesis, it was really poor timing because she passed away that same day. So it I reread her book often, and I'm really happy to see that people in crypto are starting to read Governing the Commons, because I think there's incredible models and ideas that actually relate to a lot of things outside of natural resources. But one of the things that I thought was interesting about this book is that we often think there's these two sides. There's either a public Leviathan or a public government or private, winner-take-all laissez-faire capitalism. She actually came up with this idea that both of those sides have been successful moderately and very unsuccessful in governing common pool resources. And she uses a bunch of examples and different game theory techniques to show that actually self-governing institutions, which are a combination of public and private, have a longer history of successfully managing common pool resources, and especially natural resources. And she says that actually, neither the state nor the market is uniformly successful in enabling individuals to sustain long-term productive use of natural resource systems. And she actually, sought out to prove it. So it's pretty hard to read, but this is one of her game theories where she uses an example of a common pool resource as in a sheep's field, where you have different sheep herders, they all need to use the field, and they have either two options. They can have a centralized government decide who gets which resource and, uses the field at what time and pays what amount for use of the field. Or you end up having a free market laissez-faire capitalist system in which all the sheep herders essentially can do whatever they want on the field and, even kill each other if they want, or come into non-cooperation, which is one of her terms here. And so in both instances, for the government or the centralized entity to manage the sheep field, it ended up costing sheep herders more, and they were a little bit less effective because they were trying to govern from the outside. In the instance of the private free market capitalism, you ended up having them depleting and harming the grazing field or depleting the common pool resource to the point where no one benefited because then they were all, every single sheep herder was struggling. So what she did was she came up with this new idea, and this is just the very basic model of it, where individuals come up with what she calls these cooperative strategies, but really what they do is they come into agreement in these self-enforced contracts. And she uses the term self-enforced contracts. And so in this case, you can imagine if someone decides to agree with, herder 1 and herder 2 agree, they'll come into a binding contract. All right, I'll let you use the field at this point, you use the field at that point, and they, rotate. And it's all consent-based, meaning if they decide they don't like the contract, they can get out of the contract. And it also relies on third-party arbitrators to make sure that people are, holding up their end of the bargain. This is very theoretical, and it's game theory, and she proves it with math that is a little bit beyond me. But the examples she uses in her book, Governing the Commons, are actually more interesting. So all around the world, common pool resources like irrigation systems, there's irrigation systems in Spain and Nepal that have actually modeled these, collective self-governing contract agreements where they're not relying on a nation state, nor are they relying on privatization of resources. And so there's examples of mountain villages in Switzerland and Japan. There are fisheries in both the United States and Maine, but also in Indonesia that have been using these types of arrangements for a long time. But, I'm reading this book. This book is now 30 years old, and I keep thinking to myself, we're still talking about common pool resources in a very economic lens. It's about extraction, and it's about using something for human benefit. And so there's this growing trend that's actually, people call it environmental personhood, but the whole idea is how do you confer rights to non-human entities? And it sounds a little bit wild, but there's actually indigenous communities around the world that already do this. They recognize nature with personhood. They don't think of nature as a commodity over which property rights should be exercised, which is an important thing. And it also, interesting, flips agency, meaning the question of governance over a common pool resource isn't necessarily how can we save forests, it's how can we give the agency for forests to save themselves. Here's actually, this is one of the first examples, but I think earlier in Ecuador in 2016, they granted a framework for giving personhood to all sorts of natural resources, but I think this one is interesting. So this is the biggest mountain in New Zealand, Mount Taranaki. Correct me if I'm saying that wrong. But the Maori tribe is essentially reveres it, and it now has the legal personhood as a human would. So what it means, according to the treaty, is that if someone abuses or harms the mountain, it has the same legal rights as harming the entire Maori tribe. So far, it hasn't come into any disputes, but it's a powerful example. And what it started doing was giving inspiration to other countries around the world to do the same. So, in 2019, Bangladesh gave every single one of its rivers the same legal rights as a person. It's basically assigned this National River Commission to do the suing on behalf of the entity, and the way that they would sue is that you've actually harmed a living entity, because right now, suing on behalf of a natural resource is kind of like suing on behalf of property damage, not damage to human life. And then in the same year, also in 2019, a small city in Ohio called Toledo decided, let's create this big lake which borders the United States and Canada. Let's give it legal status as an entity. And it lasted for all of like 6 months or a year. By 2020, the courts overturned it. And they overturned it for a few reasons. For one, a farmer sued the new law, saying that he has no way of guaranteeing that the fertilizer and chemicals he uses in his crops won't end up in the river or in the watershed, which ends up in the lake. So there's no way for him to guarantee that he could actually not pollute the river. There was also a bit of like legal power struggle. The state of Ohio said, citizens of Toledo, this small city, actually don't have rights to decide environmental management. That's up for the state and the federal government to do so. And really, though, when you think about this, both cases previous, rivers in Bangladesh and also this mountain, it still comes down to a similar problem that Eleanor Ostrom was describing. You have, a natural resource with personhood and with legal rights, but who enforces it? You still have to have a human suing on behalf of a natural resource. That's pretty unsustainable. And in the case of Bangladesh, their rivers are at the very end of a huge series of rivers throughout Asia, starting in the Tibetan Plateau in China, winding through India. If their rivers are polluted, are they going to sue India? Are they going to sue China? It's sort of symbolic, but doesn't really have a lot of legal teeth. And then the third problem is it's very expensive to go against large corporations and continually using trade litigation finance to raise money to do these long, protracted legal battles. So what would Ostrom say? We still think about enforcement, like I said, as something that a third party does against, two people that are harmed or a natural resource that's harmed. But using her idea of this self-enforcement contract game, and then given that she was writing that book in 1990, she had no idea. I mean, the world hadn't come up with the idea of decentralized permission ledgers like Ethereum, or self-executing smart contracts, oracles monitoring natural resources, or even decentralized autonomous organizations. What would she think about that in regards to her self-enforcing contract game? And finally, what ways in which, when we think about representing a natural resource as a person, what are the different ways in which you could do so on Ethereum, whether through a contract or an address? So I'm going back to my idea that all of these, intense weather events and climate change stories make me feel pretty powerless. So what I end up doing is thinking, what's something that's very much a part of my everyday life that matters? So I love this New York City street tree map, and I thought, let me start local. What about, how do you assign rights to a street tree in New York City? I don't know if any of you are, big fans, but I was talking to someone earlier today, and apparently Paris is going to start increasing the number of street trees. And the reason why is that their benefits are numerous. They lower the temperature by, 10 degrees Fahrenheit on average in the summertime. They directly sequester carbon and pollution. They also have like really deep root systems. So you think about the London plains that skirt the Seine River. Those root systems help prevent erosion, but also when you have an intense thunderstorm, they help with stormwater runoff. And finally, they even do things like increase property value of houses around it. So street trees, the benefits are numerous. When you think about New York City, where I live, we have literally enormous amounts of pollution coming in from the fires happening in California and in the West. It's going to be the 700,000 street trees that are the things directly sequestering all that ash pollution and subsequent carbon. It's also going to be those street trees that hopefully mitigate the damages from the next downpour that causes a flood and floods our subway system. So one day I was walking home and I was looking at a tree, and I like going on walks, but I don't consider myself an expert of trees, and saw that it was looks like an oak, but I wanted to know specifically what type of oak. So I was researching and found this open source map that the New York City Parks Department keeps. It's called the New York City Street Tree Map. You can go on that website. There have been 2 different tree censuses, and volunteers walk around and they basically have measured the distance between trees. They measure its diameter at breast height to give a general sense of its age. And they also use geographic information systems, GIS data, to do map overlays and figure out the canopy cover. So that's how you can sort of determine how much carbon sequestering and pollution that it's picking up. And it's incredible. They actually found there's every tree has an ID now. There's 689,000 trees. And there's 234 species, which is incredible. Who would have thought New York City has such rich biological life? And what it ended up doing, though, was I started zooming into these various trees, and you can go down to this level of street, and each dot represents the age and the size of the tree, and the colors represent species. And if you click on one of the trees, you can see okay, here I live on Gates Avenue. What is this tree in front of me? Yeah, it'll tell you. It'll give the ID number, the trunk and diameter, the closest address. There's a Google Map image of it. But what it also does is it comes up with ecological benefits. So this is the collective benefits of all 689,000 trees. But here's what we're talking about. Energy conserved from the cost of not having to heat your apartment or cool your apartment as much because of the trees. Carbon dioxide reduced, air pollutants, all of this. The New York City Parks Department estimates that all of these annual benefits of street trees is about $102 million. But this is just, well, I'll tell you, but it sort of made me sad to realize there's actually nothing that they're doing with this data. It's just sort of data for data's sake for tree fanatics. And there's actually no, they're not using this to enforce anything. Yeah, so if you're curious a little bit about how they came up with that value, I dug into the data a little bit, but there's, a US, there's a foundation that creates this tool called iTree, and it uses a number of different geographic information systems, overlay maps to determine canopy cover, and it's pretty complex, but it's at the end of the day, it's an estimate, and it's a formula that they use to determine it. But the formula is still pretty interesting, and you can see that a very small, young ginkgo tree that has a diameter of about 5 inches is going to end up being they'll probably estimate around $30 of value to the city each year. Whereas an enormous 200-year-old tree, like the ones we see out here in Paris along the Seine, those are probably closer to $800 to $1,000 of benefits. And so you can kind of see, if you're cutting down or if you're, building a new apartment and you need to cut down a tree to access electrical lines, and you replace it with a small tree, you're actually reducing the amount of ecological benefit or of value to the city from the ecological benefits of trees. So this is my slides from last week. So I'm actually going to get into this idea. So all of this value makes me think, oh my God, it's unused. There's ways that people should be leveraging this as collateral, as a way of enforcing certain behaviors in the city around street trees. And so there's this thing in conservation called payments for economic services, PES for short. And it's actually, there's a researcher at Oxford, this guy named Daniel Oberhauser, who actually used Ethereum for a PES payment scheme. And so I found this study, and he's using it with like a bunch of Namibian community groups that work on conservation. And he used Ethereum to come up with this thing called wildlife credits. And it's a payment scheme that some conservancies are testing out. But essentially what it does is it does direct payments to either a group or an individual for certain actions. In this case, it's for, people, if they spot wildlife in this certain corridor and are, maintaining the habitat in these migration corridors, they get automatic payments. So you go onto the site, you say, look, I just saw a herd of elephants pass through this morning. Even though they ate my watermelon patch and I want to kill them, I didn't pay me. And so PES is kind of an interesting new model for conservation, and the fact that this guy at Oxford is using Ethereum directly means that people are already seeing kind of the power of self-executing contracts, but also micropayments and not having to manage it with all the paperwork and overhead that you would normally imagine any sort of payment scheme. And so it had me thinking, look, what if each street tree in New York City, according to that map, was associated with a token? You could imagine ginkgo with a 15-inch trunk diameter, something that's probably like 100 years old, is worth $310 annually. As the tree ages, the value of the tree increases as more care is given. So using the PES model of conversion, payments would be issued to people living next to the tree based on its current value. You could also associate the tree to issue value to people living next to it based on its current value. What I mean is you could set up a PES mechanism in which trees themselves are issuing value based on how they increase in value over time. It's pretty simple. A tree doesn't need much. Mostly they get water from, rain. You do need to pick up trash because those leach into the soil. And you will start noticing trees that are treated well grow in about 5 years much more than a tree that has an impacted root bed or has a lot of trash and people not picking up after their dogs. So you can imagine there's like 5 to 10 year incentivization plans in which the value of the tree ends up paying out more to a neighborhood that's taking care of the tree bed. And then, I was thinking more about like, well, this sounds like a lot of work and it still has there's no trustless aspect to it. You still rely on a human to report directly, and you're relying on this map, which the street tree map gets updated, I think, annually, but still, not as detailed as a way that you might want an oracle to look for that data. So I ended up coming across this really cool, I guess it's like a technological art association. I haven't met anyone, but maybe there's someone from Terra Zero here at this conference. They came up with, they've come up with a lot of different white papers and ideas around conferring rights to, as they put it, non-living entities. And they, in one of their artist statements on their website say they're using Ethereum and DAOs to, quote, create technologically augmented ecosystems that are more resilient and able to act within a predetermined set of rules in the economic spheres as agents in their own right. So it's quite related to what I'm talking about. But what was very cool was this. So this is, this came out in 2018. It's at a art gallery. It's called the Shingle Pavilion. It's in Berlin. And essentially, it's a bonsai tree. And so the bonsai tree, which is in the Latin name of Premna microphylla. So it's called typo, my bad. But it's Premna daemon. And that's the name of the project, but also, the idea. And what this does is there's a web interface where using sensors on the bonsai tree itself, the sensors determine whether or not the water or, the bonsai tree is running out of water. It's determining, because this is indoors, whether or not the light has enough electricity, so you have to pay to keep the light on, essentially. or if it has too much light, in which you'd want to turn the light off. And finally, because it's a bonsai tree and bonsai trees love, their leaves and branches getting trimmed, it says like, okay, there's one more trimming left, but you can add trimmings and have. So essentially, it's this tree with agency because of the sensors, but it has human operators. And the ways in which the tree indicates when the human operators get involved is someone using this web interface connects their MetaMask wallet and sends ETH to do a certain action, whether that's continue the camera server on the tree, or even just pay for the electricity or pay for water. It's pretty far out, but I thought it was an awesome idea of non-human agency, actually test it out. And if you think about it for New York City street trees, this is completely unrealistic. You couldn't attach sensors and data to all 689,000 trees. So you kind of have to rely on incomplete, imperfect information, like the map itself, which already includes GIS data and has associated values already with it. But again, like when you talk about this large movement of conferring rights and personhood to natural resources, you realize that the primary lack and limitation right now is the inability to levy damages without a human being the conduit. It also means that it's harder to incentivize preservation or enforce regulation. You still have humans suing on the behalf of these natural resources. You still rely on the courts or governments as mediators, and you need all of this financial capital for litigation, which itself is a finite resource. So I guess this is a call. I've minted this as an essay on Mirror. You can donate to the essay or get it collected as an NFT. I don't know why anyone would want to do that, except for the fact that Mirror has these cool things called split contracts where I've decided to split some of the money to the Terra Zero art project and organization. They came up with that awesome bonsai project, and I want them to come up with more and more of these ideas. But then 70% of the money is actually going to go to Japanese Zelkova in Brooklyn, ID 4677977, meaning you're sending money to a tree itself. And what is that money going to do? It's going to pay for mulch, it's going to pay for watering, it's going to pay for upkeep. But this is just the start. This is really experimental, and I think even some of the tech to do this on Ethereum is still quite limited and experimental and expensive. It cost me about $40 to just mint the NFT and the splits contract. But I do think with tools like Mirror, you have the ability to quickly spin up a DAO, issue a crowdfund, and then give everyone who donates to the crowdfund associated tokens. And I would love to talk to anyone who has an interest in submitting a tree that's very dear to them, meaning a street tree that is where they live, and so that they can attach it to an address, which is part of this crowdfund. Everyone will get associated street tree tokens, but yeah, it's something that's being built. I want to thank you so much for your time. The essay is at jamesbeck.mirror.xyz. You can follow me on Twitter or email me if you want to talk more about it. And I also want to thank the organizers at ETHCC. I was here in March 2020. It's always one of my favorite conferences and really high quality talks, but it's tough to have anything during COVID, and I think they've done an incredible job. So thanks to all the people here, and also the community. This community is great. So I think I'm out of time, but if anyone has questions, you can probably just reach me after.